someone tell me just what is the first law of thermodynamics? I know lots of you know what it is because you asked me or you told me as I walked around. Oh, Jake wants to tell me. Thanks so much. You don't remember. Oh, and so you wanted your buddy Seth to help you out? So why doesn't Seth help Jake out? That is exactly the first law. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes forms. So the first law is really talking about how we can convert energy from one form to the other. And when we talked in our classes, I said, let's focus on the way biological organisms access energy. And the idea was that there are molecules, chemical molecules, that the sun's energy is used to make, or perhaps that are a step or two farther along the chain. Who could give me an example of a biological molecule that shows energy conversion? Let's start over. I know you had one on your sheet, Brooke. Why don't you tell me what you wrote there for number 1? ATP is definitely one. Fat cells. ATP we know from our first unit, right? It has those 3 high-energy phosphate groups, and when I break the bond between the second and third phosphate, I access a ton of energy. That's stored chemical energy that can be used and converted into other types. Fat cells would be something that an animal has that the next animal in the food chain could access if they were to consume them. Now, there would definitely be at least one more that I mentioned. Maybe think about plants and what they do. Does anyone have another molecule for this list? It's super important. It starts with a G. There, we got it. Glucose. So these were the 3 molecules that I suggested that you pay close attention to, because that's generally how energy is being converted in a biological system. Now, we didn't say anything about the second law, but just to remind you, let's talk. Who remembers what the second law of thermodynamics is? Oh, I see someone looking at their notes. What an intelligent thing to do. If you can't remember, look, what is the second law? Oh, you got this one? So, every time there's a conversion, energy, and I'm going to put lost in little quotes because is it really lost? No, it's not gone. It's just not useful anymore. And so I prefer the term not unusable or not useful. Just remember, it's not actually gone. And most of the time, this is as heat. Could anybody give me an example of something biological that produces heat? A baby rhino. So what does the baby rhino do that produces heat? But how does it get hot? What is it doing? It runs. So when it runs, its muscles contract. So let's not forget muscle contraction, no matter which muscle it is. Skeletal muscles for running, respiratory muscles for breathing, cardiac muscles for your heart. Any of the muscles in your body, which means basically any bodily function, produces a little bit of heat. The other example that I gave that was slightly different was decomposition. When an organism dies and it's being decomposed, that process, decomposition, produces heat. Those are 2 really good biological examples of the second. Now, number 2, I think virtually everybody had this one in the bag. So let's see. Taylor, do you want to tell me what you guys put for number 2? Light-colored clothes. That would be an excellent example of something with high albedo. Back here, let's see. Nolan, you want to tell me what you guys had? Snow would be an excellent example of something with high albedo. Yeah. Clouds, absolutely high albedo. And I'm even going to highlight this cloud thing. I know to you sometimes clouds look like they're gray. And that has to do a lot with how light is refracted as it comes from the sun towards us. But clouds are really good at reflecting, really, really good at reflecting. So clouds would be a nice atmospheric thing that have high albedo. But in general, things that are light colored And things that are shiny in texture, like snow or like ice, all have high albedo. Now let's just remind ourselves, what's the opposite of albedo? The word that you use for absorbing instead of reflecting. Oh, see, I was going to ask somebody who put their hand up, but I'm glad that you know the answer. So I'm going to write down, today, Nolan was excited about biology. It's in the lesson, it's recorded. All right, last question, a similarity and a difference between photo and chemosynthesis. Go. You would think that he's making a joke here, but I'm gonna go take this one a little bit further. They both have synthesis. That means they are both making something. So he is not wrong. What are they both making? What is the substance that's being produced by both of them? We might have even written it down in the first question. We are making carbs. Now, is it always glucose? Not necessarily, but glucose is a carbohydrate. Specifically, they're making reduced carbon compounds. We're taking CO2, right? We're taking CO2 and we're adding hydrogen to it to make something that has carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. It's not always going to be glucose, but that's the idea. We're reducing carbon dioxide. That happens in both of them. So that's what synthesis means. I am making something. So let's focus on a difference now. What is different between the two? There are many things that you could say. Okay, you're on a roll, so let's take one more. So, the plant is the one that is taking energy from the sun to make the glucose. In chemosynthesis, what type of organism is it? Well, it's different. We have bacteria that are found on those tube worms, which I'm going to show you a little clip of here in just a minute. And those bacteria are the ones that are performing it, not a green plant. And what's the source? Does anybody remember it? Because it's not the sun, it's something different. Where is the energy coming from? Hydrothermal vent. And the key thing is that sulfur is present there. Sulfur is necessary. That's the chemo part of this. In photosynthesis, we're using light. In chemosynthesis, we're using this heat from the vents and the sulfur that is present. So we are talking, to start this lesson off, about trophic levels. Now, you might not have heard them discussed as trophic levels before. That might be a piece of new vocabulary, but the concepts are one that I'm sure that you have learned every couple of years in science since you were in grade 1, because this is a revolving topic in the curriculum. We're calling them trophic levels because they explain to us how an organism accesses their foods so that they can grow. That's where the word trophic is getting its meaning. You might have heard this word before. I know in grade 9 science, because I taught it, niche was one of the first things that we introduced as a topic. And a niche is a way of describing the role an organism occupies in their ecosystem. What do they do? What is their job? And in terms of energy flow in the biosphere, we are going to focus on 3 basic niches. A trophic level is another way of referring to a niche if we're talking about what is its position in the food chain. So a niche is a little bit bigger of an idea. It can be more things. Trophic levels are specifically about the food chain. Where are you in the food chain? How are you accessing energy? So we could call the trophic level a type of ecological niche. So you'll see that there are 3 basic levels: producers, consumers, decomposers. Those are the 3 basic categories. Are there subcategories? Of course. These are just 3 basic ways that we can set things up. So what is a producer? 99% of the time they are plants. But let's put a little star because we know now, because of chemosynthesis, that it's not always going to be a plant. Sometimes it will be organisms at the bottom of the ocean who do not have access to sunlight. What do? They take energy and use it to make carbohydrates or other large compounds out of inorganic things like carbon dioxide and water. So what did I just describe in this whole sentence? I described what photosynthesis is. If you can remember what's happening during a photosynthesis reaction, that's what that sentence is describing. So remember, when I ask you questions and you're explaining yourself, if you prefer to use a chemical reaction instead of a sentence, you can show me what's happening. You don't have to say it with a sentence. The other word that I put down here is the word autotroph. An autotroph is a word we already saw when we talked about photosynthesis the first time. Remember, auto means you're doing it yourself, on your own. And troph is talking about how we're accessing food. So an autotroph is getting its own food. It does not need another organism. So any type of producer, whether it's a plant or a chemosynthetic bacteria, is an autotroph. It's making its own food. Now the next category is a consumer, and this is the category where we will have a whole bunch of other subcategories afterwards. You'll see on the next slide there are a bunch of terms that you're probably fairly familiar with. A consumer is an organism that either eats producers or other consumers. So see, I'm not specifying how high up in the food chain they are. I'm simply specifying how they access their food. The other word we could use here is a heterotroph. You already saw this word too. Heterotrophs are organisms that cannot make their own food. Hetero is talking about a difference. So a heterotroph gets their food from another, from a different organism. So remember, troph is always talking about how you're accessing your food. And the prefix to the word is saying whether it's you or someone else that's providing it. So you'll see under the picture of heterotrophs or consumers, I put a big pyramid that had a bunch of different organisms in it. It's a big fish at the top with some smaller invertebrates and even some smaller microorganisms that would be in water. All of those things could be considered consumers. They're not all at the same level, but they're all eating either a producer or other consumers. Now the last one is a decomposer. A decomposer is different than a consumer because we're talking about dead material. We're talking about no longer living organisms. They have died. Normally a consumer is eating a living organism or one that has recently been living. This is where we're talking about not consuming the material, but converting it. So I would say the key word here is convert. Decomposers aren't trying to eat another organism. They're trying to convert the molecules into something different. Here, we're going smaller. So producers were making large compounds. Decomposers are taking them back to the small compounds that we started with so they can be reused. Normally it would be by a producer, but it could be other organisms depending on what the molecule actually is. Decomposers are also called heterotrophs because they are not producing their own food. The way that they obtain energy is slightly different. They're not eating it, they're decomposing, but they're still accessing it from another organism. So I put down here a worm. A worm is a really great example of something that would be a decomposer. Another good example of something that can decompose are fungi. And then there are a number of types of small microorganisms that can accomplish it as well. So we'll pause here just for a second. Here you have a number of different terms. Now the first set all have to do with numbers: primary, secondary, tertiary. Now I could keep going with those numbers. I wrote the first three so that you could get the picture of what was happening. And I've even got a picture on the side that shows a primary, a secondary, a tertiary, etc. The other words I have down here are words that you probably know a little bit about. Maybe not that last one. Maybe the last one is new and it might be a little trickier. But what I'd like for everybody to do is take a few minutes right now. So I noticed quite a few people doing something so super intelligent. Instead of just asking me what's the answer or waiting, they took out that big fat green book that you all have and they looked it up. That's being resourceful, hey? That's knowing where you can find your information. So we're going to start with the ones that have numbers: primary, secondary, tertiary. Now you have two food chain examples here on the side, terrestrial and marine, so that you can have perspective. About what type of organism would fill each of these roles, whether you're on land or on water. If I'm talking about a primary consumer, I'm talking about this level here. So what do I see at that level? I see a herbivore, so it looks like a little crickety type thing, and I see zooplankton. Now some of you might be comfortable with what a herbivore is, but perhaps not zooplankton. Plankton are small organisms that live in water, and you've probably heard the word plankton before, but maybe not the two kinds. Zooplankton starts with zoo. You think, what do I find at the zoo? Animals. Zooplankton are like an animal. Phytoplankton, that phyto at the beginning is talking about light. So those are the photosynthetic version of plankton. Those two organisms are almost always part of my aquatic food chain examples because they're often the beginning. And so I'm pointing them out specifically so that you can see them. Phytoplankton would be a producer, zooplankton would be a consumer. So a primary consumer eats the producer. That's what it does. If you said a primary consumer is a herbivore, you are correct. A primary consumer is eating the producer. So here under herbivore, where lots of you probably wrote eats plants, you could also put primary consumer. They're the same thing. They're the same level in the food chain. Now, secondary consumer, if I look, is one step up. The secondary consumer, you can see on the picture, it says that it's a carnivore. Now, does it have to be a carnivore all the time? The answer is it doesn't. A secondary consumer simply eats the primary consumer. So it's the next level up. Does that mean it can't also eat plants? No, it just means that it's eating the primary consumer. It could be eating other things as well, but if we're going in a line, it has to have one organism between it and the producer. So what does a tertiary consumer do? If the primary consumer eats the producer, the secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, what does the tertiary consumer have to do? Eat the secondary. Now, does that mean the secondary consumer is the only thing that it eats? Not necessarily. It just has to be consuming something that is 2 steps up from the producer. Now, I walked around and I think most of you were comfortable with these words, herbivore and carnivore. Herbivores eat plants, carnivores eat meat, they eat tissue. Now, a carnivore could be secondary or tertiary, or we could keep going. It could be quaternary or cinquenary. I won't ask you to know the terms that high up in the food chain, but just know that the numbers could keep on going for a number of steps. Now, an omnivore eats both plants and meat. So an omnivore is hard to define as just a primary or secondary consumer. We would say that an omnivore is a primary and a secondary or tertiary consumer because it's going to eat the producer, but it's also going to eat tissue. We are, for the most part, omnivores. If you are a vegetarian and you are not eating tissue, then you would be more of a primary consumer or a herbivore. Now, a scavenger. Does anyone know what a scavenger is? So a scavenger, I'm going to give you an example. A hyena is a good example of a scavenger. Do you know what hyenas do? Have you seen The Lion King? I know it's a bit past your time. Well, see, but sometimes I talk about movies that I don't think are that long ago, and then I'll go home and my husband will be like, well, what year did it come out? And I'll look, and it'll be like 1994, and you guys weren't even born yet. But hyenas are scavengers. They look for dead organisms, but not because they're going to decompose them. They're not decomposers. They're looking for an organism that some other predator has already killed that they can just steal away and consume for food. So that's why hyenas are always kicking around where the lions are, because they are trying to hit the jackpot on a lion's kill. Now a detritivore, that's a tricky one. A detritivore is something that eats waste. So we could go with flies or maggots. These are the types of organisms that you would find in your yard where your dog has gone to the bathroom. So my little dog, when she poops in the backyard, it's just tiny little poops. It's not huge. But some dogs, like my brother's dog, make these big things, and you see right away flies and other insects floating around, and it's not because they like the smell, well they probably do, but that's their food source. That's what they're using for food. So these are all consumers. They're all slightly different types of consumers. The last one where the definition was already written is a saprotroph. It's an organism that digests its food outside of its body and then takes it in. It's called absorptive nutrition. That's different than how we eat. We eat by ingesting. We learned that in the digestive system section. Fungus and molds are the kinds of things that are saprotrophs. So food is digested outside of their body and then they just absorb it. Most of these fit in the decomposer niche. So mushrooms are the kinds of things that would be our typical example of this type of organism. So when we're talking about trophic levels, most of the time, for simplicity's sake, we will do a food chain. A food chain is linear. That means I have one producer, one primary consumer, one secondary consumer, and it all goes in one straight line. What's more realistic is a food web. Now, food webs are tougher because you have to know about every interaction between organisms that can exist, and sometimes it's quite difficult to know everything that an organism eats all the time. You with us? You good? Yeah? It's easier when your eyes are open, hey? So down here are a couple of examples of food webs. I'm not asking you to memorize these. I want to illustrate to you what it looks like in real life. If I were to take an organism and show how it's related to other organisms, what would I see? So over here in this thing, I've got a bunch of things, and it's kind of based off of fish. So you see I got a salmon here, and there's a bunch of different types of birds that could consume the salmon. We have a consumer at the top that might be consuming all of those. But notice that most of the organisms have more than one food source, or they are the food source for more than one organism. And so in real life, this is more realistic. Now, in terms of an exam question, it makes it a little tougher if I were to ask you about a food web, because there's lots of interactions. So what I might ask you in terms of a food web is to recognize how organisms are affected by one another. So let's say I take this food chain, this food web, and I talk about the algae. Now the algae, I can see, are getting eaten by this thing called a sedge and this thing called Daphnia. It's a little fruit fly. It's also getting eaten by the tadpole. So if I affected the amount of algae, I would immediately affect those three organisms because they are directly attached to it. But don't forget that it keeps on going. If I affect algae, I will indirectly affect dragonflies. I will indirectly affect geese because now I'm affecting their food source. So when we think about food chains and trophic levels, we have to remember that there's direct connections, but then we have to keep following the food chain a little bit further.